I'm Cameron Howard, and I teach Old Testament at Luther Seminary. And I'm glad to be with you this Valentine's Day to talk about some great love stories of the Old Testament. You know, the Old Testament sometimes gets a bad rap for being exceptionally violent or for being angry or something like that. That anger or violence are the kind of core emotions or themes in the Old Testament. And I would say that that's very much not the case. In fact, I would say that the relationship of God's steadfast love for Israel, and then Israel's reciprocating that love for God. That is the core relationship, and love is the core emotion of the Old Testament. So I'm excited to spend the next few minutes with you looking at some examples of love stories in the Old Testament. I've chosen four love stories for us to look at. There are so many more that we could look at. And these are not necessarily stories of um, dating, marriage, romantic love, but of some key relationships in Scripture. And there are so many that we could talk about that we're just scratching the surface with these. And our first two are very much about romantic love. We have first Jacob's love for Rachel in the book of Genesis. So, Jacob, one of the patriarchs of the faith, Rachel, one of the matriarchs. We will look at their meeting and what Jacob does in order to be able to marry Rachel. We will look at the love poem that is the Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon is how it usually is in English Bibles. And here we have this unnamed female lover and unnamed male beloved. And so she will describe her beloved and her longing for her beloved. And then his voice also comes through. There's a lot of first person speech in here. It's really remarkable poetry. So we'll look at that. Then we'll look at the very interesting relationship between David, that is, who will be King David, and Jonathan, the son of Saul. And some scholars understand this to be a relationship of deep friendship. Some scholars understand it to be more than friendship. And so I'm going to open that to you to decide. We'll look at some of the key texts in that relationship, but certainly there is this um, very, very intense affection between David and Jonathan that will lead Jonathan basically to betray his father and let David know when he should flee from Saul. And then finally, as I've already mentioned, God's love for Israel, and then through Israel, the world, is this core theme in the Old Testament. And so we'll just think about a few ways that love is manifested and how we can see it in Scripture. Look at it, just a couple of texts, but of course, again, that's a theme that you could open your Bibles to most pages in the Old Testament and find in one way or another that special relationship between God and Israel, and then through Israel, the God and the world represented there. So, first, the story of Jacob and Rachel. I encourage you to follow along in a Bible. I'll have on the slides some excerpts from these stories, but of course, to get the full sense of them, you would want to read more than what I can fit on a slide. But we come to this story around Genesis chapters 28 and 29. And so we'll remember Abraham is the father of Isaac, and Isaac is the father of Jacob and Esau. Esau is the older son, and Jacob, though, comes out holding the heel of Esau, right on his heels. That birth order is such an important thing to remember in the book of Genesis, especially that the name and property and blessing and birthright, they all go to the firstborn son. But interestingly enough, in Genesis, we see that order thwarted over and over again, that it's not the firstborn son who ends up necessarily with the blessing, or there are obstacles to that blessing. So there are a lot of just really, really good stories in the book of Genesis, and the stories that are around Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, are certainly among them. And so Jacob is sent by his father Isaac to his relative, to his uncle Laban, to find a wife from within the family. This was a common practice of endogamous marriage, that you would marry within the family or tribe. And so at Genesis 28, verse 5, Isaac sent Jacob away to Laban, um, the, the brother of Rebekah, Jacob and Esau's mother, to try to find a wife somewhere there in Paddan Aram. And the scene at which Jacob first sees Rachel is at the well. She has brought the flock of her father's sheep, to come and be watered at the well. And the well is where many of these kind of, I don't know, a courtship is probably too strong a word, but these meetings of future husbands and wives are set in the book of Genesis, and in fact elsewhere. So in Exodus, Moses meets his wife Zipporah at a well when she is there with her sisters, watering the flocks. They're harassed by other men there, and Moses chases them away, enables them to give water to their animals. So that's the scene here at the well. And so we want to go to chapter 29, around verse 9. So while he was still speaking with them, so that in our previous paragraph is Jacob speaking to the men at the well. Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she kept them. Now when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of his mother's brother Laban, and the sheep of his mother's brother Laban, Jacob went up and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of his mother's brother Laban. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and wept aloud. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kinsman, and that he was Rebekah's son. And she ran and told her father. When Laban heard the news about his sister's son Jacob, he ran to meet him. He embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. Jacob told Laban all these things, and Laban said to him, "Surely you are my bone and my flesh." And he stayed with him a month. And so this begins what becomes a long period of Jacob staying there with Laban. So let's keep reading a bit. At verse 15, then Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be?" And so this is the moment then when Jacob will say that he would like to marry Rachel. So verse 16. Now Laban had two daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were lovely, and Rachel was graceful and beautiful. Now, this is a really interesting sentence. One thing you may have noticed as you've read the Bible is that Hebrew narrative, that is the stories of the Old Testament, do not give long, elaborate descriptions. They're very efficient in the way they present their prose. So when you get details, they're worth pausing over. When you get adjectives, when you get these kinds of descriptions, as we get in verse 17, because Hebrew narrative tends to run on dialogue and plot. So rather than long drawn out descriptions. So we have here what the NRSV translates as Leah's eyes were lovely. Um, you could also translate this as Leah had weak eyes. Perhaps she couldn't see well, um, or dim eyes. It's unclear if the word is referring to their appearance or their ability to see, but it's certainly contrasted with, or could be contrasted with, and this word that's and, we could translate in Hebrew as but to make a contrast. Rachel was graceful and beautiful. That is, she is beautiful of shape or form as well as beautiful of appearance. So she's shapely and beautiful. So this is a very kind of specific comment on Rachel's appearance. And that's something that, again, we don't get a lot of descriptions like that in the Hebrew Bible. So it's just worth noting that it's there. And then this remarkable sentence, Jacob loved Rachel. Now, the marriages in Genesis are very much about having children, having sons, especially, this concern to carry on the line and to carry on the promise. So, if you recall, God promises Abraham that he will be the father of a great nation and all nations of the world will be blessed through him. But he's an old man and his wife, Sarah, is an old woman and they don't have any children. And so, um, the description of their relationship primarily centers around this tension of, will they have children to carry on this promise from God? And that theme of sort of wondering if there will be children comes up over and over again. And so kind of descriptions of the affection between marriage partners in Genesis are just very rare. And so it is remarkable then to see that Jacob loved Rachel. So he says to Laban, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel. And so that younger daughter should kind of make our ears perk up, because we know that Genesis values birth order in the sense that it loves to upend birth order. And so Rachel is the younger daughter. So we're going to keep that detail in mind. So at verse 19, Laban said, it is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel. So he's working for Laban for 7 years. And then this detail is beautiful. And they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. So this is the closest thing to a sort of description of a loving relationship that we get in Genesis. Now, we should note that we hear primarily Jacob's point of view. We don't hear much about Rachel's point of view, and you hear how Rachel is being handed over, right? There are negotiations about the women on their behalf done by the men, and so we should acknowledge that. That's important. This is not a reciprocal description of the relationship. We hear at verse 12 that Rebecca ran and told her father, but we don't know exactly what she feels about it. So that's important to remember. We are limited in these descriptions very much in terms of often just getting the male point of view or hearing these relationships talked about as sort of kind of almost economic negotiations, really. But nonetheless, this kind of language of affection is absent from much of the writing about marriage in the book of Genesis. So it is remarkable to note here. Okay, so we know that Jacob is going to work and does work 7 years for Rachel, but maybe you remember as this chapter goes on that when the time comes for Jacob to marry Rachel, they have a big party, a wedding feast. But Laban, rather than sending Rachel into the wedding night tent, sends his older daughter Leah instead. And so Jacob consummates the marriage, but with Leah rather than with Rachel. And we hear at verse 25 that this is a surprise. We can ask ourselves, why was it a surprise? She was probably veiled when she went into the tent, but how much celebrating had Jacob done? There are lots of questions it raises. Nonetheless, biblical narrative is very efficient and very economical and does not always give us all the details that we would like to know. And so at verse 25, when morning came, it was Leah, behold. And Jacob said to Laban, what is this you have done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me? And Laban says, this is not done in our country, giving the younger before the firstborn. And we should note also that Jacob stole the birthright and blessing by deceiving his brother Esau and then also his father Isaac. So he as the younger son, stole the birthright and blessing from his older brother. So in some ways, he's getting his comeuppance here in this story because um, he has asked for the younger daughter, and Laban has tricked him and said, no, you must take the older daughter because we don't give the younger before the firstborn. So work another 7 years for for Rachel, and then you can marry Rachel. And so that is what he does here. He served Laban another 7 years. And at verse 30 it says, Jacob went into Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. And so this sets up continuing sibling rivalry and a difficult family dynamic between Leah and Rachel, and particularly when it comes to having children. And while we're talking about love and romantic love and Valentine's Day and all of that, I wanted to point out in Genesis 30 this reference to mandrakes, which were understood to be an aphrodisiac. So in this competition between Rachel and Leah for the affections of Jacob that is sort of ongoing in the marriage, as well as a kind of competition for who will be able to bear sons and bear the most sons and all of that. We have this interesting little episode here at chapter 30, verse 14. In the days of the wheat harvest, Reuben, who is Leah's son, went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? And so then they make this negotiation. Rachel says, then he may lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes. So Jacob comes in from the field, and Leah says, you must come into me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. And this is when Jacob's fifth son, Issachar, is conceived. And then later, God remembered Rachel, and she has Joseph, her first son. So her bearing of sons is delayed. She has Joseph, and then later will die in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. So some interesting little details about relationships and the ancient aphrodisiac of the mandrake. And if any of you are fans of the Harry Potter novels, you may remember that mandrakes have a very different function in Harry Potter, that they can be made into a potion to cure people who have been petrified. It's in Chamber of Secrets. but here a very different function indeed. The other account of romantic love I want to talk about is in the Song of Songs. And the Song of Songs, which is also known as the Song of Solomon, is erotic love poetry. It does not talk about God. It does not uh, talk about Israel. I mean, there are some sort of oblique references, but the what the story is about, or the poetry, excuse me, is about this longing and this relationship between lover and beloved, so a woman and a man. And much of the song is the woman's voice, but then the man's voice answers back. And in the history of interpretation of this book, in Jewish interpretation, it's often interpreted as the love of God, but the love between God and Israel, so interpreted allegorically. And then in Christian tradition, it's often been interpreted as the love between Christ and the church. But on its face, it is love poetry between an unnamed lover and unnamed beloved. One thing that I think is interesting to notice in the Song of Songs is how different the metaphors are. So if you were writing love poetry today, right, the comparisons that you make to describe your beloved would draw on probably, right, 21st century imagery, or even kind of classic imagery of the modern era. Think about Robert Burns's poem, "Oh, My Love's Like a Red, Red Rose. It's newly sprung in June." You know, uh, that's a metaphor. The simile is just a type of metaphor. My love is like a red, red rose that we readily understand. When we come to the Song of Songs, some of the comparisons are less familiar, and so it's neat to just see what was considered a beautiful description in the song. It's called the Song of Songs, in Hebrew, Shir HaShirim, which is a way of indicating the superlative, that is, the best song. And the Song of Songs is traditionally ascribed to Solomon. That's why it's sometimes called the Song of Solomon. But we have no evidence generally that Solomon wrote it. Uh, so, he had a reputation. He's also credited with Ecclesiastes for his wisdom, but associated with Song of Songs because he had so many wives and concubines. Okay. And it does, of course, it begins with a superscription, the Song of Songs, which belongs to Solomon. But again, it, the Hebrew in it is later than the kind of Hebrew they would have spoken in the time of Solomon. He is associated with the song by reputation rather than by actual authorship. And so let's just look at a couple brief sections of this poem. Here I'm the lover I'm calling the woman, and the beloved the man, because she refers to her beloved throughout, and much of it is in her first person speech. So this comes from chapter 5, verses 10 through 14. My beloved is all radiant and ruddy, distinguished among 10,000. His head is the finest gold, his locks are wavy, black as a raven. His eyes are like doves beside springs of water, bathed in milk, fitly set. His cheeks are like beds of spices, yielding fragrance. His lips are lilies, distilling liquid myrrh. His arms are rounded gold, set with jewels. His body is ivory work, encrusted with sapphires. So those metaphors, right, like doves beside springs of water, bathed in milk, fitly set, so that they are, I suppose, a nice distance from each other. his cheeks like beds of spices. So all of these uh, images are very particular to the kind of sensory world of ancient Israel in before the Common Era, we'll say the mid first millennium BCE. So that probably a little bit later than that actually, but they're very different perhaps than the images that we would bring to love poetry today. In the next poem, this is the beloved speaking of his lover. So returning the praise. How beautiful you are, my love. How very beautiful. Your eyes are doves behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats moving down the slopes of Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of shorn ewes that have come up from the washing, all of which bear twins, and not one among them is bereaved. Your lips are like a crimson thread, and your mouth is lovely. Your cheeks are like halves of a pomegranate behind your veil. Your neck is like the Tower of David, built in courses. On it hang 1,000 bucklers, all of them shields of warriors. So we have this wonderful set of images that, so the hair like a flock of goats moving down the slopes of Gilead. If you've ever seen animals sort of run down a hill, you can kind of imagine in some of these sweeping nature documentaries, for instance, when you see big herds or flocks of animals that are running together and they make this sort of undulating motion. So then your hair is like that, the sort of falling beautifully. Your teeth are like a flock of shorn ewes. That's, I would be very surprised if my husband presented me with a love poem that compared me to goats and ewes, right? But it's very appropriate to the milieu of ancient Israel. Next, we have David and Jonathan. Here's a rather gruesome picture, right, of David and Jonathan together right after David has killed Goliath, the Philistine, and sawed off his head, which is not something that we usually highlight in the children's versions of David and Goliath. It's just the 5 smooth stones, right? But then once he's dead, he decapitates him. So who is Jonathan? Jonathan is Saul's son. And you may remember that Saul, first king of Israel, is at first, sort of finds David, right? When David kills Goliath, this brings fame to David, and Saul takes notice. So the David and Goliath story is in 1 Samuel 17. And then Saul, at the end of that chapter, wants to know who this child is, right? And who is his father. And as soon as Saul and David meet, then David answers Saul at 1 Samuel 17, verse 58. Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." Now continuing. When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan, Saul's son, was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day, David, and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that he was wearing and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. As a result, Saul set him over the army, and all the people, even the servants of Saul, approved. So we see here, first of all, that David and Saul are allies. David works for Saul, basically, right? He's sets him over the army. Um, but as Saul and David are establishing that relationship, David and Jonathan are establishing a relationship. It's a very deep friendship, and you can decide for yourself if you read through from 1 Samuel 17 into 2 Samuel, the beginning of 2 Samuel, Jonathan's death. And I will leave it to you to decide the nature of this relationship. We have, well, I'll show you what we have to go on. First of all, this sort of love at first sight, that is this deep affection that David and Saul have for each other from the very beginning of David's being in Saul's household, and they make this covenant. They sort of pledge to look out for each other, and that's going to become important because Saul is going to turn on David, right? He's going to not be his friend and boss anymore, but be his enemy. And so we see this in 1 Samuel 20, verse 12. David really starts to surpass Saul in reputation. People are really interested in David's power, and Saul is worried and jealous. And Jonathan knows that it's possible that Saul is going to want to kill David. And so in this scene in 1 Samuel 20, Jonathan said to David, "By the Lord, the God of Israel, when I have sounded out my father about this time tomorrow or on the third day, if he is well disposed toward David, shall I not then send and disclose it to you? But if my father intends to do you harm, the Lord do so to Jonathan, and more also if I do not disclose it to you." So that is, even though Jonathan is still on his dad's side ostensibly, he has this covenant with David, and he makes this vow that if he finds out Saul wants to do harm to David, then he'll tell him, and if not, likewise. So there's this whole scheme where he like shoots an arrow, and it's what he says to the boy he sends to get the arrow determines what David will hear, and they have this kind of secret code. So I encourage you to read that going forward. But verse 17, Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own life. So this language of loving David as he loves his own life or his own soul comes up again. To make a very long and interesting story short, eventually both Saul and Jonathan are killed in battle by the Philistines. And so, Goliath was a Philistine. Let me back up and say that Jonathan determines that Saul does want to kill David. So David basically becomes a fugitive. He's on the run for a while, and he actually becomes a kind of vassal of the Philistines for a while, kind of fights for them out of necessity, or for some of their allies. But eventually the Philistines kill Jonathan and Saul. And so there is this lament that David sings for Saul and Jonathan that we hear in 2 Samuel chapter 1. And you probably recognize, right, that phrase that we might say a lot now, how the mighty have fallen. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Jonathan lies slain upon your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. So David and Jonathan it's certainly something more than a bromance, right? They are not just sort of like big pals. That they have this deep affection for each other. They are friends who vow to look out for each other and are meaningful to each other. Whether it's more than that, as I said, scholars debate it, and you can read and decide for yourself. But certainly, it is a very moving story of friendship and affection that we find in the Old Testament. And at last, I want to then talk about, though, God's love for Israel as this core love story of the Old Testament. So God chooses Abraham in Genesis, and Genesis 12 says, um, go to the land I will show you. I'll make of you a great nation. All the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. When the children, that is the descendants of Abraham, end up in Egypt, and a king arises who didn't know Joseph, that would be then Abraham's great grandson, right? Who had arisen to power in Egypt. A new king arose. The Hebrews are enslaved. God hears their groaning, delivers them from slavery, delivers this people, right, from slavery with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, brings them first to Sinai to give them the law being an expression of God's love for the people, and then bringing them into the promised land, establishing the covenant, or an addition. There are multiple covenants, right? But continuing that covenant relationship of God's chesed is this Hebrew word. Chesed means steadfast love or loving kindness, and refers very particularly to this covenant love that God expresses for Israel. And that when the Israelites stray from their fidelity to God, right, God is continually bringing them back, continually offering forgiveness, continually bringing them back into the fold, never letting go, never abandoning that covenant relationship, even when Israel strays. So that is this core story of the Old Testament, that the Old Testament, God's love and forgiveness for and relationship with humanity, is there. It's there already. And the New Testament builds on what is already established in the Old Testament. I want to lift up to you this psalm as an example of the psalmist praising God for God's chesed, God's steadfast love. It's a Psalm 36. Again, poetry, right, to express the deep emotion. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Your righteousness is like the mighty mountains. Your judgments are like the great deep. You save humans and animals alike, O Lord. And you can read the rest for yourself, but the theme of steadfast love here, and naming sort of all of the parts of creation to which it can compare and to which it reaches. There is this wonderful testimony to God's continuing faithfulness to the people. And finally, because of God's love for Israel, Israel is then invited and commanded to love God and love neighbor. So the law, the giving of the law, is an expression of God's love for the people, and then keeping the law is the expression, the people's expression of love for God. And the core of Old Testament law is love God and love neighbor, right? And so Jesus then echoes that, interprets that, builds on that. We turn to Deuteronomy 6. Hear, O Israel, this is the Shema Yisrael. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And then in Leviticus, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And then further, the alien, that is the sojourner who resides with you, shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So God loves Israel. Israel loves God and loves neighbor. Thank you for listening. It's been fun taking a quick tour of a few love stories in the Old Testament with you.